Welcome to Widemindedness with Victoria Ball, the podcast in which I interview expert guests who want to join me in celebrating that life is not black and white. Our society is increasingly divided, and the us versus them mentality seems to dominate our conversations and relationships with others. I believe that life is much richer when we widen our minds to consider multiple opinions and perspectives. So challenge your assumptions and let's become truly wide-minded together. Welcome to part 2 of an interview I recorded with Eamonn Gearon about the Islamic Golden Age. When we left off last time, we were just talking about how prevalent polymaths were during that period.
Working out astronomy from them and then writing poetry about that.
I have a post at Johns Hopkins SAIS. They received a massive endowment at the University of Johns Hopkins from former New York Mayor Bloomberg. I mean, it was tens of millions, but it was specifically earmarked for cross-disciplinary studies. So it had to be split between departments to bring people together so they could be sharing ideas. And he recognised that that's critically important in the modern world. And another example I would cite, the collegiate system that exists in Oxford and Cambridge and elsewhere is fascinating because it does every night at supper have the potential to bring together people from different disciplines. And I think it's just a tremendous example of how we shouldn't be siloed into, well, the physicians sit over there and the literature people over here. That this bringing together of people with different interests in a sort of collegiate environment is tremendously powerful.
So
as you said, 3 characters, 3 stories, 3 different perspectives. So the first one is going to be Haroon alRasheed. He's a legendary Abbasid Muslim caliph ruling in Baghdad and one of the greatest sponsors of the so-called House of Wisdom, which we will discuss in due course. And he reigned from 786 to 809 and died a relatively young man at the age of 43. The second character we're going to look at is a Christian king. I thought we would mix things up a bit by introducing Roger II of Sicily. Again, another period in history people perhaps don't know as well as they might, but the Normans controlled southern Italy and Sicily for some time. We think of the 1066 and all that, and the invasion of England by the Normans, but they had a much wider range, and of course originally they came from the north, the northlands of modern day Scandinavia. But here we have in 1130 the coronation of this Norman king down in Sicily that we're going to discuss, and his 24-year reign on Sicily. And then the third and final character I thought we could have a look at is, I don't know where to begin really, with Moses Maimonides. I mean, in terms of rabbinical scholarship, it's difficult to find people who say he wasn't the greatest of all time. He was born in Muslim Andalusia in 1135, but is forced into exile and dies in Cairo then just at the start of the 13th century. So there we have a Muslim caliph, a Christian king, and a Jewish scholar and physician and traveller and so on and so forth. So those are the 3 characters I think that will give us a sense of the diversity and range of experiences that cover the Islamic Golden Age.
fantastic, and they are glittering examples of the people that existed during this period.
And for anybody who was tuning in thinking that I'd be talking about Al-Kindi or Al-Biruni or Ibn Sina and so on and so forth, my apologies.
There's so many. Al-Farabi, we could go on.
Exactly.
So if we start with that Muslim caliph you mentioned, with Haroon al-Rashid, could you tell us a bit about him?
Sure. The names are often tricky for people, aren't they? Names that from cultures that we're not familiar with. Well, Haroon is the Arabic for Aaron. So, for people of a Judeo-Christian background familiar with the Old Testament, think of Aaron. And al-Rashid means the orthodox or the rightly guided. So Haroon al-Rashid, you could think of as Aaron the Orthodox. So he was the 5th of the Abbasid caliphs. um, considered to, well, let's talk about his legend first, shall we, before we get down to the facts.
Absolutely.
If Western readers know any caliphs, Haroon al-Rashid might just be the one, because he is mentioned repeatedly in the stories of the Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights, as they are also known in Arabic, Alf Layla wa Layla, 1,000 nights and a night. And those stories talk about a just king, a wise king, and I'm using the term king interchangeably for caliph. It's not strictly speaking true, but I think for listeners it's easy just to use the label to indicate his authority on earth.
Yes.
Haroon al-Rashid there's often stories of him in the Arabian Nights leaving his palace at night in disguise with a cloak and a hood on, and walking through the streets of Baghdad to listen to what his subjects, rich or poor, are discussing, and their views of him as much as their woes in everyday life, and then going back to his advisors and demanding that something be done about this problem or that problem. I mean, that's a fictional account for sure. But the fact is that we have accounts from travelers at the time saying about how peace reigned in the city. Now, peace doesn't just reign because you've got a strong army or police force. There was a sense of Haroon al-Rashid's Baghdad was a flourishing center, the most successful city in the world at that time, the largest, the most polyglot, the wealthiest. And that doesn't come from force of arms alone. So certainly there was this sense of enlightened rulership with Haroon al-Rashid.
Mm.
I mentioned a few minutes ago the House of Wisdom, or Beit
Beit
al-Hikmah,
al-Hikmah.
as it's known in Arabic. Yeah. So this was an intellectual center set up by one of his forefathers, another Abbasid caliph. And it was initially a center for translation. So I mentioned earlier on that when the Arabs arrive in Persia, they recognize there are limits to their knowledge, perhaps, and the culture that they have, and they want to learn from the Persians. Well, the House of Wisdom did just that. They encouraged people to bring texts or send volumes from anywhere in the world, and they would be translated in the House of Wisdom. They did this because they wanted to acquire basically all the world's knowledge. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that they weren't obviously looking for Islamic texts, because there weren't any that
Yeah.
predated the emergence of Islam and the Arabic language. No, they were interested in texts from Persia in Persian that talked about astronomy, astrology. They followed both at the time, of course. They were looking to India for histories, for native medicine. They were looking to China for texts on government. And I suppose for Western audiences, what's most important, or what we see or perceive to be most important, is how many texts they got from ancient Greece that were translated in Baghdad. Texts that we know for a fact, had they not been translated in the House of Wisdom, we would not have Aristotle today. I mean, that's just breathtaking, perhaps, but
Yes,
it's true.
absolutely. Actually, I could have asked you just to speak on the House of Wisdom for the whole episode, because I think this one institution was so important. This idea that there was a state-sponsored movement at this time to collect knowledge from the known world is extraordinary.
It is, and there's a couple of things to say. Is that they invested very heavily in this. It was said that when you translated a text, you would be paid the weight of that text in gold. I think it's really important to understand that that weight of gold wasn't just for Muslim scholars. It was paid to Jewish and Christian scholars and Zoroastrians and people that traditionally aren't considered of the book, i.e. not Jews, Christians, or
Yes.
Muslims. You know, the head of the House of Wisdom, at least the head of the translation section of it, was a chap called Ibn Ishaq, who was an Arab Christian. The caliph was smart enough to say, look, we don't care about your faith, we just want the best people for the job.
just to remember the dates we're talking about, 786 to 809. This is a very long time ago. There's this glittering hub of experts in their field from around the world translating this for the sake of knowledge.
And sometimes the House of Wisdom is seen by its critics as just being a translation centre. And so, well done to them. They translated a bunch of ancient Greek, and then the Europeans took it up in the 12th and again in the 14th century, and that was that. But no, that's not the case. I mean, they were definitely interpreters of this material as well. The number of books that Ibn Ishaq translated that we have today, I mean, it's staggering. Everything from Plato's Republic, most of Aristotle. He translated an entire Greek language version of the Old Testament, which unfortunately no longer exists. But what he also did was a fascinating development. So anybody involved in translation work will know that you don't take a text and make a literal translation, word for word. But that was often the case before developments in translation under Ibn Ishaq and Haroon al-Rasheed's reign. So he had to understand idiom and nuance and inference. And then he would have a team that would retranslate it, sort of reverse engineer it to see how close it would get back to the original. I mean, this was an astonishing process to make sure that they weren't bending the meaning. But at the same time, they were able to interpret for their own times, as any translation must.
This is a stage of rediscovering languages, but also they were selecting the knowledge that they saw as having an inherent use.
And they were creating, as you say, rediscovering languages and creating new lexicons and dictionaries. Yes. I suppose it's worth mentioning that these translation movements, they were happening in Andalusia or modern day the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. That was another polyglot center. It was happening in Persia. It was happening in Cairo and Basra in southern Iraq today. To situate it again for listeners more familiar with Western history, Haroon al-Rasheed was around at the same time as Charlemagne. And that Charlemagne indeed sent emissaries to Baghdad and brought gifts to the court of Haroon al-Rasheed, including horses and colourful cloth, cloaks and hunting dogs and these sorts of things, which, presumably Charlemagne thought were the greatest things that he had to show to try and make contact with this great power in what was called the East. It's not recorded whether or not Haroon al-Rasheed was terribly impressed with bolts of cloth, horses and dogs, but we do know that Haroon al-Rasheed, that is, sent gifts back to Charlemagne and a diplomatic mission. But that consisted of much more elaborate and much more glorious objects. There were silks, candelabra made of brass, perfume, ivory chess sets, an elephant, for goodness sakes. That was something that hadn't been seen by Charlemagne before, I'm sure, and a water clock that would mark the hours by dropping bronze balls into a bowl to chime. Charlemagne's court, when confronted with this clock that chimed on the hour, decided it was the work of Satan and that it should be destroyed. It wasn't destroyed at that time, but that was certainly what his wise men advised him to do, because this was clearly sorcery or magic of a kind that shouldn't be brought into the royal household.
So if I ask you to take us from this blossoming centre in Baghdad over the Mediterranean and jump forward a little in time to the 12th century, you're going to introduce us to that Norman Christian king you mentioned, Roger II of Sicily.
He is one of those characters that I find endlessly fascinating, and it's another one of those moments where, and this is absolutely no criticism of my education, there are only so many hours in the day, but when I was at school, I didn't learn anything about Middle Eastern history whatsoever. He was born in 1095, so that's where we are, just at the end of the 11th century. Roger had this coronation robe made, a mantle that was draped over his shoulders. This is a cape made almost 900 years ago, and it's red silk, richly embroidered throughout, and it shows camels and lions. But then around the base of this coronation mantle is an inscription, which isn't unusual on coronation robes, saying, "Hail King Roger, crowned this day in Palermo." Well, he was crowned in 1130, but the date that is written on this mantle is 528. So here we have a discrepancy of some hundreds of years. And the reason being was because, A, the craftsmen who embroidered this mantle were writing in Arabic. They were Arabic-speaking craftsmen who he had employed to make his coronation robes. And the date is the Hijra, or Islamic calendar. And that calendar starts with the exodus of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. I just think that's astonishing. And it wasn't that he had the wool pulled over his eyes and they played a cruel trick, because we know for a fact that Roger was fluent in Arabic as well as his mother tongue. This was a man who understood the importance, stuck down there, as you can imagine, in Sicily, in the Mediterranean. He had North Africa before him. He had to understand local languages to be able to trade, get on with, and receive diplomatic missions from Arabic-speaking peoples. He just wanted the best person for the job, whether it was a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. He had the best craftsmen, he had the money, and he employed the best people to do this work for him. Somebody who worked in his court, another fascinating character, back in 12th century Sicily, is a chap called Muhammad al-Adrisi. Now, Muhammad al-Adrisi was a geographer, cartographer, and he produced an atlas of all the known world called the Book of Roger, dedicated to Roger. At the same time, he built, which sadly is no longer with us, a sphere in silver that was essentially a globe made of silver, in which he'd punched out all the outlines of the continents as they were known at that time. I mean, a most incredible piece of work by every description that exists, every contemporary distinction that exists. Perhaps even more important than employing a single geographer, let's think of the law, because not everybody is equal in a medieval kingdom, but Roger II does something quite astonishing. So in order to quell a lot of this sort of petty uprisings that were destabilizing Sicily, and had done before Roger came along, he came up with a new legal code in 1140. So he's been on the throne for 10 years, and he rolls out this new legal code, the Assizes of Ariano. And there are 40 clauses in these Assizes, and by any measure, they are remarkably forward-looking. They touch on virtually every area of legal concern at the time. But what's important about these 40 clauses was that he consulted people from his kingdom of all backgrounds and traditions in order to come up with a document that would work for everyone. There's no point in having a legal code if it's not one legal code for all. And the Assizes state, for the record, that whether you were a Norman, Latin, Lombard, Greek, Jew, Muslim or Arab, you were all equal under the law. And also, he brought into those Assizes not just pre-existing Norman and French legal codes, because they're very obviously there. He introduced legal theories from the Eastern Roman Empire, from Byzantium, and also Muslim Sharia law, where it worked for his subjects and his rule of law. I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it?
Yes.
In the sort of first half of the 12th century, to have a legal code that recognizes the rights of all citizenry, and really does. It's not just sort of a Magna Carta where the barons get to have their say. This is for all citizenry. And we know that it was implemented and it worked. There was a Muslim writer at the time, a traveller, who writes about his experiences in Sicily, and he says the Muslims were treated so kindly, they were protected under the law, even from the Franks, which is the general word for Europeans, but French in particular. Because of that, the writer went on, that the Muslims loved their King Roger. That's a traveller passing through. That's not somebody who's stuck there and has to suck up to the king.
If perhaps people have any notion of Middle Eastern history at all in this Middle Ages period, it might be that they're thinking about the Crusades and a lot of periods of vast antagonism and fighting. And this is just such a counterbalance to that.
Yeah, and sometimes these are flashes. Sometimes it's just, one individual's rule. It might be a period of 30 years, 40 years, 50 years in the middle of the next ruler coming along who's less enlightened. But you know what? The less enlightened rulers generally don't do so well. I mean, the history of this period shows it to us time and time again. we think of the Crusades in themselves as being declarations by a pope against, to take the fight to the Middle East, to retake the Holy Lands, etc. But we should remember that there were lots of crusades declared against Christians, Christian rulers who the Pope didn't like. Roger II was one of these. He had a crusade declared against him by the Pope at one time.
Interesting.
Partially because of his tolerant attitude to his citizens, and partly because he wouldn't bow down before the Pope. He recognized the Pope's authority up to a point. He also had the coins from his kingdom. They were stamped in Latin and Arabic. And that's not just a gesture. That's not to be nice. It's because if we think about where Sicily lies, he was then able, with one coin, to have a currency that could be used on both sides of the Mediterranean, and traders who understood Arabic in North Africa could use it as much as Europeans. So this again was a really successful, smart economic policy that he was introduced. While I'm talking about coins, there's a fascinating object. King Offa of Mercia. He ruled at the very end of the 8th century, 760s, 70s, 80s, 90s he ruled. There's this fascinating coin, though. Look up King Offa's coin. It's inscribed in something very clearly in the middle that says Offa Rex, King Offa in Latin. And around the edge of this coin, there is something which looks like Arabic. But if you try to read it as an Arabic reader, you can't. It's a pseudo-Arabic. Now, just think where we are. Even by that time, the power and influence of the Muslim kingdoms, word has gone so far that a king of Mercia is trying to emulate coins that have Arabic inscriptions on as a means, I would argue, of opening up a form of diplomacy, an economic diplomacy, a form of common currency, no pun intended, so that we could have better, if not integration, at least understanding between these.
Unusually, I have divided this interview into 3 episodes. Because Eamonn is telling us about a whole historical period and how its moments of wide-mindedness were key to its success, I feel it's so important to listen carefully and learn from it for our own times. I really hope you agree and come back for the last instalment.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Widemindedness with Victoria Ball. Help others learn about it by rating, reviewing and subscribing. For more great wide-minded content, follow @Widemindedness Victoria Ball on Instagram, @Widemindedness on Twitter, and sign up to the monthly newsletter at victoria-ball.com.